Israeli media reports say that Israel is planning to reopen Gaza's key Rafah border crossing with Egypt, but one security source said that it could take days. Thousands of tons of food and medical supplies have been waiting to enter the territory as residents return to find their homes in ruins.
As a fragile truce appears to hold, people in Gaza are getting on with the basic business of survival, returning to the ruins that were once their homes and desperate to feed their families. After 2 years of war, the situation on the ground is dire. Food, water, fuel, and medicine are desperately needed. Despite calls for urgent and unhindered humanitarian relief in accordance with President Donald Trump's peace plan, aid is moving at a glacial pace. International groups say it must come faster to save lives.
Now, when it comes to the aid, the answer is no, not yet. The shift has not yet happened. We are still witnessing, only few trucks coming in and large crowds approaching these trucks in a way that is absolutely not conform to humanitarian standards.
Border crossings, which serve as critical entry points for aid, remain heavily restricted. Israel says that's because Hamas has failed to return all the bodies of hostages it is holding as part of the U.S.-brokered ceasefire deal. Security concerns and logistical challenges have further slowed the process, adding to the misery and frustration for hundreds of thousands of Gazans.
Israel says that it expected the remains of more of the deceased hostages returned under the terms of the ceasefire. I asked our correspondent in Jerusalem, Emily Gordine, what's the latest on negotiations behind the scenes?
So we understand that Hamas will hand over 4 more bodies of the remaining deceased Israeli hostages. That brings the total number to 12 out of 28 in total. 7 of the deceased Israeli hostages that have been already returned have been identified as hostages. The 8th report suggests is not a hostage. It appears to be a Gazan. There has yet to be an official response, though, from the Israeli government. Overall, though, the process has been very slow, and the Israeli government certainly has called this a violation of the agreement. It responded saying that there will be sanctions, meaning the Rafah border crossing will remain closed and aid will be cut in half. Now, there are conflicting reports in Israeli media whether Israel will reopen the border crossing or will not. As it stands, the border crossing is closed, and we understand though that more and more trucks are making their way to Rafah in Egypt, from Egypt, and so there is some hope that that there will be some manoeuvring there at some point in the next coming days, at least.
And the humanitarian situation on the ground in Gaza remains dire. Where does the aid situation stand?
Well, first of all, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which was set up to facilitate aid over the last few months, and which was set up to basically replace the UN after allegations of the UN letting aid fall into the hands of Hamas, an allegation which was not underpinned with evidence. But this organisation had nonetheless received significant support from the US and Israel. Now, this organisation, under this new ceasefire plan, will not play a key role. In fact, it will, according to Israeli media, cease to exist, cease to operate in the next coming days and weeks. The UN and similar organisations like the Red Crescent will take over operations. They're already playing a key role. We understand from the UN that they have been, it's been easier for them to get aid into Gaza these days because of the withdrawal of the Israeli military. That means they have to coordinate less. They've been able to bring vital medical supplies to the remaining Gazan hospitals. But they also say that the road to recovery is incredibly long and aid is desperately needed. 600 treks a day is the absolute bare minimum of aid required. We're not there yet. And so they, for them, certainly say that more needs to be done to make sure the needs on the ground are met.
And Emily, the ceasefire appears to be roughly holding despite a number of incidents. What is next in the Gaza peace plan?
Well, talks on the second phase of the deal have already begun. This is when the two sides will have to hammer out some of the more significant issues of this 20-point plan that was put on the table by Trump. This plan is very vague. Negotiators will have to do a lot of work to get the two sides on the same page, essentially. And some analysts certainly say, because, you know, when we're talking about the main differences here, we're talking key points are the governance of Gaza, the role of Hamas, the withdrawal of the Israeli military, disarmament of Hamas. Big question marks loom over these aspects. And some analysts are worried that if this process takes too long, and we're already seeing signs of this, Hamas will have time to re-establish its authority on the ground. We're already seeing that from a sort of military point of view, where security forces of Hamas are patrolling the streets and are engaged in fighting with other militias. And the question is just whether how that will play out in the future. But also, as more time passes, Hamas will also be more engaged in the civilian side of things. And if Hamas is not to play a role on the ground, then these talks need to hurry up, essentially, to make sure that Hamas's influence is not entrenched on the ground.
Emily Gordine in Jerusalem, thank you. And while so far the Gaza ceasefire is holding, what happens next is less clear. U.S. President Donald Trump's 20-point peace plan is short of specifics for how Gaza will be rebuilt. What is certain is that winter is approaching, which means additional hardship for the territory's largely displaced population.
Gaza in ruins. A field of rubble, an estimated 60 million tons, that used to be houses, hospitals, schools. Few homes remain, and the vast majority of Gazans are now unhoused refugees in their own territory, with winter on the way. The solution is not far off, according to U.S. President Donald Trump.
It's so beautiful to see a new and beautiful day is rising, and now the rebuilding begins. The rebuilding is maybe going to be the easiest part.
That may be optimistic. Rebuilding Gaza will be a monumental task, and there is no deal or agreement in place on how to do it. Clearing those millions of tons of rubble and dangerous munitions in areas that are in some cases still under Hamas control is the first challenge. Thousands of dead bodies are thought to be under collapsed buildings. Decomposing bodies can cause serious health risks, including cholera and tuberculosis. Emergency housing as the weather turns colder is another major challenge. With an estimated 90% of houses damaged or destroyed, many Gazans have nothing to return to and have been living in tents under catastrophic sanitary conditions. Long-term housing and infrastructure will take the longest to rebuild, potentially over a decade. Nearly 80% of Gaza's roads are damaged, and most of its hospitals and schools are in ruins. Hamas ran Gaza's infrastructure before the war, and its control of these institutions could be a sticking point. Trump's plan for Gaza includes a, quote, Trump economic development plan that would create a panel of international experts to create investment opportunities that could help pay for rebuilding. The UN says at least $70 billion will be needed. Financing the rebuilding is the greatest question mark of all. The money will have to come from somewhere, whether as a business investment or humanitarian funding. With long-term control of Gaza still up in the air and Hamas resisting surrendering its power, it may be a while before the question is answered.
And let's get more on that. We are joined by Andrew Gilmour. He is a former UN Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights. He spent over 3 decades working in some of the world's most challenging conflict zones, including the Middle East. Welcome to the program, and thank you so much for your time this morning. Speaking of time, I mean, as we've been seeing there, the time pressure in Gaza is immense. Hundreds of thousands of displaced Palestinians urgently need new homes, hospitals, schools. How do you begin the process of rebuilding when you don't even know who will be in charge there in the future?
So what I would say that, as your reporter ably presented, I mean, we are dealing, people who have spent a whole lifetime in conflict and in reconstruction have never seen anything like this. The scale of the systematic deliberate destruction the vast number of munitions dropped on the small area of Gaza, which equals dropping on Berlin, London, Hamburg, and several other cities combined during the entire Second World War. How to deal with this, as pointed out, 60 million tons of rubble needs to be collected. So it's going to be vast, and as we saw yesterday, because as you can imagine, finding the remains of all the bodies of the hostages is hard, and there was a delay in finding the remains of some of them, and immediately the Israelis cut down the desperately needed trucks of aid going in now. So I mean, there are a lot of trucks in there on the border waiting to go in. They've been waiting to go in for months to try and avert the famine that's going on. I don't know quite to what extent the Israelis are actually going to allow people in, are going to allow the equipment in to remove the rubble. And by the way, a lot of the rubble is not to be able to be removed by equipment, because inside that rubble, 70,000 bodies have been found already. That's the casualties figure that's mentioned. But underneath that rubble, there are going to be tens of thousands more. And of course, you can't just have the heavy equipment picking that up. You're going to need individuals scrubbing through the rubble to try to find those remains.
So then how do you see the next, weeks and months unfolding right now for Gazans? Because, you have on the one hand those immediate humanitarian needs that you have articulated, but on the other, you have the fact that this is a conflict which is not fully resolved. Does it need to be before true reconstruction can really begin?
Right. No, well, above all, it's essential to try to, after these 2 terrible years, it's essential to try to keep hope alive, not only on the part of the people, but for who are living there, but also for everybody who's going to need to be involved in trying to provide the stuff that's so desperately needed. Okay, so no, you don't need full peace to start the reconstruction, but you're going to have to need some pretty strong assurances, because what we have seen in the West Bank, which is obviously not ruled by Hamas, where the EU have been trying to do various bits of development and have been building many structures, and they have been quite often destroyed by the Israelis, and then the EU rebuilt them, and then the Israelis destroyed them again. Of course, that means that the people who are going to need to put up the 60 billion, as has been estimated for Gaza, are going to need some form of assurances that the Israelis aren't going to go and destroy it again. And I don't know where we are on that. I mean, I am pretty convinced that the EU and the Gulf Arab states, who are going to be asked to pay large portions of this, are by no means convinced that they're going to have those assurances. So that is perhaps the most important factor. And it doesn't stop the vital aid that needs to go in, or the temporary housing that's going to be required. As you said, winter's coming up, and we need to protect the people.
Okay, I'd like to switch gears a little bit and ask you to also address another aspect of this, because Trump has recently made it sound like the war is over and that the conflict is in the past. But where and how do you see this aspect unfolding? Where is the time and space for accountability and addressing human rights violations?
Well, there we have the great issue of what basically the rest of the world sees as the West's double standards, where we are quite rightly pushing strongly for accountability for war crimes that have taken place in Ukraine, carried out by the Russians. As we have seen in the last 2 years, there have been measures put forward, mainly by the International Criminal Court, but also by the International Court of Justice. And there we have found countries like the United States and Germany in particular doing basically all they can to undermine those processes. So there is going to be a lot of appetite for trying to find some accountability for what essentially people see as a very, very wide selection of war crimes, basically carrying out, and the whole range that is possible of war crimes, they've all essentially been committed in Gaza. And there's going to be pressure for accountability, but there's going to be counter pressure, as I said, particularly in Washington and Berlin, to trying to find justice.
And we have to say in the past days, there has been so much elation that phase 1 has been agreed here, but also the acknowledgement that phase 2 is anything but guaranteed. What, if anything, gives you hope with the conditions that you're currently seeing that Gaza can indeed be rebuilt as a place where Palestinians live peacefully alongside Israel and that there can be a lasting peace?
I think the greatest source of hope for me is that this Trump agreement addresses the tremendous flaw at the heart of the Abraham Accords that, as you know, came out in the first Trump administration, and that flaw, that great gap, was that the Palestinians were left out of it. It was done on the assumption that if Israel makes agreements with other Arab countries in the Gulf and elsewhere, then somehow the Palestinians will essentially lose morale so much that they will drop all their demands for any form of autonomy or statehood or anything like that, as we saw to brutal and reprehensible effect on the 7th of October 2 years ago. It had the opposite effect, and the Palestinians became desperate, and Hamas carried out the abominable act. It did. So that gives me hope that finally now people are looking at the Palestinians, and that, as I said, had been taken off the table during the Abraham Accords. That's one. And the other is that the Gulf are now involved. I mean, they have shown that they have a lot of influence with the Trump administration because they have so much money, and that is something that has such currency with the Trump administration. The fact that the Gulf Arabs are ready to be taken seriously, that gives me hope. And those are two areas. And the fact that we are now seeing, and if Trump gets involved, and as we can see, he does have great energy, but perhaps not so much in terms of attention span, if he can stay involved and carries on telling the Israelis, and not just the Arabs, that there will be consequences if they rip up his deal, which I'm afraid some of them are very keen to do, then there is hope.
Thank you so much for sharing that perspective. Former UN Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights, Andrew Gilmour. We very much appreciate it.